you.
One that you've all been waiting for, subdivisions, development and earthworks.
Yeah. So there's only been one change since you saw this last, and that is on page 5, so you don't have page numbers, at the bottom of table 2. And all it's done is to add a zone that was forgotten to be included, so it adds a zone and a minimum lot size for that. And that is the only change. But you wanted me to talk to you about cycleways. So earlier David talked to you about the construction standards, and that's one aspect. And I'm going to talk to you about how we're requiring cycleways through the subdivision chapter. So there are some objectives and policies which set out the need for cycleways and multimodal transport. I think there's 2 objectives and about 4 or 5 policies that talk about those things. Sure, okay. So objective 8.1, oh no, this is from phase 1, sorry, so you won't have it in front of you.
No.
So there's an objective on design and amenity which talks about cycleways. There's an objective or a policy on sustainable design and resilience that talks about cycleways. There's a further policy on integration and connectivity which talks about cycleways. So and there's some others as well there, but they're providing direction for the consents planners when they get an application for a reasonable size subdivision. They can look at these. So this enables us to look at having cycleways included, for example, in a greenfields area. At a more sort of closer in level, there are no rules requiring cycleways, but there are assessment matters. So at section 8.3.2, which is access or property access, there are 4 assessment matters which relate to cycleways, and that gives the council the ability to require those 3 conditions of consent through negotiations on outline development plans and other plans. Specific to the new neighbourhoods zone, again there are no specific rules, but there are again a raft of assessment matters that talk about cycleways and when and where and how we might do those that enable us to get those. And sorry, I should say also that the new neighbourhood zone requires a context plan, a site plan and some other kind of plan, which I forget the name of, and they all talk about cycleways and transport as well. So there's plenty of scope for us to negotiate those things in where we want them and how we want them. So not necessarily along sides of roads, but they could be through the subdivision away from or set back from the road where that's appropriate.
So just to reiterate, a lot of what's been asked this morning has actually gone through under stage 1. The stage 2 chapter, subdivision earthworks chapter, deals just with the new zones and putting in place the subdivision development and earthworks rules for the new zones that are going through stage 2.
So, and the assessment matters for the new neighbourhoods zones are the same for the Living G, which is part of phase 2, so that will, those assessment matters relevant to cycleways will be relevant to Living G as well.
Sure. So you're happy to take questions now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I've got Jimmy.
Question. But what's the difference between this chapter, especially for the subdivision development, and the previous chapter 20, the concept plan for the future urban development? What's the difference?
The difference is that this does provide for that zone as well. The future urban development zone is, I guess, putting those areas of land specifically into a holding pattern and saying that it's not that it can't be developed, but we'd prefer it not to be. Whereas this, and the provisions in this, you can go and do a subdivision in that particular zone. It's at a higher activity status, and there are provisions specifically around how you would do that.
And the future urban, they're areas, not zones. They're not zones.
Yanni?
Takamatua and Robinson's Bay comprehensive development areas.
Yep.
I note that you've got a lot of controls there, and just wonder whether you've done an assessment versus the statement of expectation and
that's
you know, the developers, because this is the kind of stuff that we're removing from a number of other parts of the plan, but is being put in here, which is quite restrictive.
Yeah, so that there are things that, so there are a number of areas like this where there's been sort of an extensive decision through another process that we've been somewhat reluctant to dabble with too much. So there's been community involvement in on these things previously, and to go back and sort of relitigate that, and we've tried to avoid that unless there's a good reason to do so.
So, I mean, I really like what you've got in there about that, and I'd love to see that put into the other character areas, but we seem to be taking those things out.
Yeah, or we're not including them when we're doing new character areas. Yeah, that's the problem with deleting some of those, is that the people who've bought land or own land around that have a set of expectations, and to go and take those away makes it difficult for them and for us, unless there's a good reason to do so. And I think that some of these provisions in terms of landscape on the peninsula are warranted in some of these areas.
Except, like, I mean, if it's possible, I'd like to move that we do something similar around the Port Hills living zones, because that's what the community have asked for previously, and yeah, I don't see why we couldn't do it.
I'm not sure, what are you asking for in the Port Hills?
Port Hills zones, where you get new residential development, that there's a set of, I don't know what you call these things, rules, guidelines,
Yeah,
assessment matters, similar to Takamatu and Robinson's Bay.
yeah. I'm not a landscape architect, but I think that the Port Hills is a different environment from some parts of the peninsula, where we're talking about Takamatu and Robinson's Bay, sort of small areas where they're generally not very built up at the moment, and wouldn't be even through these plans, whereas the Port Hills has got quite a substantial amount of development, and a lot of the areas due to be developed, or where there are provisions, include landscaping, for example, on the Port Hills, rather than colours of your building, but they do include some things to sort of head down the track you're talking about.
Could I just say that it's too late for us to do anything to change this residential zone at this stage. So there are two options. You can either choose to hold back the residential and it come back to you at the same time that we look at the others, the natural hazards and the cultural and heritage, or we can do some further work on this to see whether or not it is in fact feasible to add in more defined rules like this for the port zone, and you put that in as a submission, Port Hills, right, as a submission. So there are two other ways of getting around this issue, or not around it, but dealing with this issue. Either hold it back or put it in as a submission. Either way, we certainly couldn't make the decision today, because we've done I'm not aware of any analysis being done to include such detailed rules like this across the entire Port Hills residential zones.
Say, put in a submission, do you mean as a council?
Yes, you might recall that once the plan is notified, we as council can also make a submission to change something that's been notified.
Well, there might be no point in doing that if there isn't the support for that change anyway.
As I say, the residential chapter as it's come to you now has come to you for a reason, and it doesn't include those rules. So if you're asking us to now look at potentially highly detailed rules for the whole area of the Port Hills, we would need to be careful.
No, I appreciate that. Look, is there a will from the committee or the council to hold it back or put in a submission?
No. Submission, yes. Hold it back, no.
I don't think it's getting majority favour though, Yanni.
Well, no. But what I'm saying is you can still put this chapter through.
Yes.
And not this chapter. I'm talking about the residential
Yes,
chapter, and then in the meantime we'll look at it further, and potentially if there is the ability to add such detailed rules, we'll put it in a submission later.
Okay, do you need a resolution or anything around that, or are you just comfortable to...
No, I've just made a note that we'll come back on that, because we'd relook at it at that time.
Oh, Paul, sorry.
I just want to know what putting a whole lot more rules on the Port Hills for future development, what that's going to cause.
Well, that's exactly why I'm suggesting we take away, we look at the possibility, and if it's appropriate, we can bring it to you as a change through a submission, once it's noted, after these chapters are notified.
Okay. All right, well, do we have a mover for this? No one's going to move it? Tim will move it. Right, and seconded Phil. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Opposed? Carried.